Encyclopedia of imaging expertise. And so, with nearly 25 years in the field, Don's credentials include being a CIIP, a fellow of SIM, and he's also shaping the future as an item writer of the CIIP exam and a member of the JIM, the Journal of Imaging, Informatics, and Medicine editorial board. And we also have Michael Toland. Michael is a healthcare IT powerhouse with a career spanning over 25 years. He started as a systems engineer at HP, where he supported, get this, AOL data centers. That's going way back. And Michael made the leap into healthcare IT and never looked back. So now, as the director of enterprise imaging at the University of Maryland, he's overseeing a lot of really cutting edge technology. And we're going to be hearing his experience from a migration perspective. So, with all that said, I'm going to stop sharing and I will hand it over to you, Don.
All right. Can you see my slide deck?
Good.
All right.
Thank you.
Good. So thanks, everybody. Mike and I are going to break this down into kind of two sections. I'm going to start with what you've seen, the first four bullets here, and then he's going to cover off the last four. Before I get started, I just wanted to kind of set the tone. When organizations are doing a data migration, we're primarily going to be talking about medical imaging migration, but we'll also touch on things like reports and conversion of data from proprietary to standards. We'll touch on all that stuff. What I often tell people who are about to embark on this is that you need to kind of anticipate or expect that some of the data that you've been storing may not be able to be migrated. Either there's a problem with the structure of the data, it's corrupt, or it was never valid in the first place. You're also going to find a lot of things, if you take the time to look at the data, you're going to find a lot of things that you didn't expect, missing attributes, incorrect attributes, patients that didn't merge, those kind of things. So we're going to talk a lot about that. But I kind of want to level set that because people kind of often look at data migration as how fast can I move stuff from bucket A to bucket B, which is a key important thing to decommission the old system. But a lot of what we're going to talk about today is looking, because of the fact that you're touching all that data, many organizations take the opportunity to try and examine it and make sure that it is high quality, so consistent, complete, accurate, that kind of thing. So I'm going to start off with the strategy development. And this is going to talk about three areas: the governance, the approach to doing a data migration, and also the scope of the migration. So the first part is governance. You have to basically, you have to make determination of how you're going to make decisions and who's going to be involved and responsible. Some of these decisions are going to be things that are very nuanced, that relate to more clinical information or more technical information, may relate to health information management and records and policies. So, and then I'll give you some examples of those need to be made. So typically what you do, or organizations do, is they form what we call a multidisciplinary team. It can involve radiology department leaders, PACS admins, or other roles that understand things like order fields and DICOM attributes. It can involve health information management team members and those that know about the EMR record retention practice and policies, and other key stakeholders, including imaging researchers, people responsible for modality calibration exams like phantoms, clinicians who access this data. And typically, as part of that governance, you really have to brief them on the purpose of that team so that they understand the kind of decisions they're going to be asked to. Perhaps not all of them will be asked to weigh in on every decision, but really getting them to focus and understand that you're going to need their expertise and guidance as you start to discover issues with your data as you're moving it. Other things you may be asking them about is record retention and purging policies, record correction and acceptance, data conversion from proprietary formats to others. So this can include things like the scope of the data to migrate. Are you going to migrate all exams or only exams from a certain year forward? The sources of the data, there may be more than one legacy image archive. There may be other sources like really old stuff on tape. You have to make decisions on what you're going to do with those things. And you need to have decisions on remediation of these sets of records. So you say, okay, here are 1,242 exams that have a missing session number. What are you going to do with that? Or here are a bunch of exams that have a session numbers that don't match the standard schema that you're using. So they may be foreign and unknown to information systems like an EMR. So what do you want to do with those? Do you want to generate new ones, prefix them, leave them as is? So there's a whole bunch of things that have to be decided in those. The next step is typically understanding the approach. So are you going to be self-managed with tools? So for example, if the new system you're putting in place, you want to migrate to the destination system, has data migration tools, which your staff is trained on, are they going to manage that themselves? Are they going to license some tools and do it themselves? Or are you going to outsource this, which is typically more common, but that may be outsourced to the destination system vendor, like the PACS or VNA vendor, who they themselves may subcontract it to a specialist who just does data migration, or you may contract with a dedicated solution provider who does these type of data migrations. So some of the organizations I've encountered, often due to the perceived cost of the outsourced data, they look at the price tag and say, hey, my team can do this. We know imaging inside and out, and they're quite confident in that ability and quite confident in the data, confident in the data that they're going to migrate. Often opt to do that type of thing if they have those tools to do it. It's really important if you are in an organization that says, hey, we're going to take this on. It's really important for transparency and governance to remain key. Why I say that is a lot of times self-managed data migration processes, the people who are doing it are also the people who've been responsible for the data. They may convince themselves that some problems aren't really problems, or they may ignore or fail to report some quality issues because they don't want to do the extra work, or they don't want to tell people that, the data they were responsible for was in that state. So you have to make sure that if you're going to do it internally, you really have some truth to what's happening. And the internal system teams may know the systems. They rarely have the same level of experience as a migration specialist who has seen not only all the issues that may come up in the data, but often have an understanding of the causes, like what would have happened that would have caused this to be in this state, and can provide guidance to that enterprise to say, here are what other people have done with the data. They just ignored it, they kept it, they purged it, they updated it, that type of thing. And a lot of the stuff about a data migration is automated, but it does require regular monitoring and intervention. So if you do it yourself, you have to really make sure you understand who's responsible. So if the data migration process that's running 12 different threads starts to fail in the middle of the night and you're on a deadline, is somebody going to be on call for that? You really have to understand and monitoring the progress of it and reporting on that. A lot of people underestimate the labor involved in that. They kind of figure they can set it and forget it. And in order to do these things well, you really need qualified, knowledgeable staff. And then and those people are always have other priorities that are pulling on their time. So you may say, hey, we've got some really smart people. We've done some data migration in the past. We can take this on. But do you have the bandwidth to deal with this stuff when it runs into issues or processes are failing, or you have a lot of stuff to deal with, in addition to the other high value things you'll be working on? So for those organizations that do contract with the vendor providing the new system, or might be subcontracting, or dealing directly with a data migration service provider, the deployment of the data migration tools are going to vary. So as well as the number of sources that you may have to connect to. So you may have multiple data migrations running in parallel. You may have like 4 legacy packs you're consolidating into one or into a VNA. So you really have to understand, how does those tools get deployed? Are they deployed in the cloud? Are they deployed on site on VMs? So really understanding that process. And the other part is, depending on their experience, they may have some pre-built tools to more effectively extract data from specific legacy systems. So for example, they may have written specific connectors that can get a much higher data rate out of the legacy system than a standard DICOM rate. And they may be able to provide additional value-added services like data conversion. They can, well, we know how this particular vendor stores their markup. So as we do this, we can extract that from the database, convert it to DICOM GSPS, assign the same study instance UID and a new series UID and object, and then store that in and then validate that. So those type of things, if you're going to do it yourself, are often not available. So you really have to understand the cost of outsourcing. It may seem high, but there's often a lot of tools and expertise that they bring that you're going to have to either address or ignore. The next thing people have to deal with is the scope of records. So, and first let's talk about the types. So obviously the imaging exam images, but also you can look at things like evidence documents. And as I said, sometimes historic ones are proprietary, looking at reports, and then also going how far back. So when you start to identify the data to be migrated, typically the images, any evidence documents that are in DICOM format are converted to it, and prior reports are included in the scope. But some records may be deemed out of scope. And for example, you have to make decisions like, when you do these routine modality calibration images like CTs, where you're using phantoms and stuff, those are required to be kept for a period of time that clinical engineering has to keep as evidence they've been doing it, but they may not need 10-year-old ones or 5-year-old ones. And depending on how disciplined you were in acquiring those and consistent you were in terms of the artificial patient you were using, if they've been randomly typing stuff in, they may be harder to detect just by looking at the data go by. So you have to be prepared to have a decision on those. You may have people who have inserted interesting cases or teaching file cases. You have to determine, is there a mechanism to migrate those to the new system? I've worked with groups who had a virtual bucket in their packs of outside Telerad cases that they had done overreads for. They wanted to keep them, but they weren't linked to any patient identity that they had in their own systems. But the outside org that submitted the exam is really responsible for long-term archiving. So you have to make a decision: are we going to keep this shoebox of images from however many years back that aren't understood by any information systems, or are we going to purge these? So those are some examples of stuff that you may come across. Now, faced with the data migration process, a lot of organizations ask the question: do we need to migrate all of this data? This 18, 20-year-old ankle X-ray, how important is that to bring along? So with a lot of orgs, they have 25 plus years older, and the value that priors for comparison is limited. And the reports for those exams are often not imported into the EMR. So as someone deemed the results not important enough to keep. So this is an issue where you have a PACS that has 25 years of images and reports, and EMR that when it went live, they only imported 7 years worth of reports, and it's now 3 years later. So they have 10 years. So if you're going to decommission that PACS, in some cases, it's the only system that still has those reports. So you have to decide, are we going to do a report extraction from the legacy PACS system and into the new system? And often when it talks about retention, or are we going to migrate all this data, what I've encountered is a lot of organizations struggle to answer the question: who can or will decide and put that decision in writing to not migrate some data and permanently delete it? So oddly enough, the policy decision, in my experience, often is not that somebody decided, hey, we're going to keep everything. It's that they can't figure out who has what authority to say we're going to permanently delete a bunch of old medical records. So the de facto decision is migrate everything and pay for that. And some orgs will often say we need to keep it all because they want to keep it all theoretically, because they believe that they're going to develop some AI algorithms, and they want to use it for training and validation. And they may actually plan to do that, or they're dreaming of it, and they may just say this justifies us moving all of this data because we need as much as we can get. So these are some of the things you're going to run into. The next step is really looking at the statistics of what you're talking about. So how many exams? Ideally, you get that by exam type and the year that it was acquired. Typically, if you're using a data migration service provider, they will do a full inventory or catalog of all that stuff and will tell you all of this data. You may have to, if the source system doesn't have the tools to give that to you before the data migration service providers has been engaged. For example, if you want to develop a more accurate statement of work, you're going to want to give them some bounds of the data that they're going to have to do. You may have to go to the legacy PACS system vendor and open a ticket and ask them to do some analysis. I've seen that on older systems. So when you're accessing older data sizes, also consider things like image compression. So very old data may not be compressed. So some people will look at more recent data and just collect off of that, or only go back so many years when they're doing their statistical analysis. But you have to consider you may see variations as you go back. It's not converted. Also, if you're dealing with things, legacy systems that have proprietary data, like the Hologic breast imaging SCO format, and you're going to be converting those to the DICOM standard BTO format. In my experience, the BTO format is like 2.5 times larger once the exam is converted. So you can't make the assumption that the data required to store the legacy data will be the same that's required to store it in the future system. So it's important to consider all of those systems, all of those variables as you're looking at the data. So then when you look at the data sources, you have to understand the systems involved. So you have to have an inventory of all those things, including, ideally, you want things like what is the software version of that system, contacts of the staff, your internal staff who knows those systems, vendor contacts, like collect all of that stuff up, because as you go through the process, you may need to invoke expertise either internally on the legacy system to understand something, or on even open tickets with the vendor or engage them. Some data migration service providers have developed tools and methods to extract metadata directly from the source system database and the data directly from the storage. They might call this a direct connector or something like that. They'll have different terminology. What this allows them to do is they're basically bypassing the DICOM service, application service. They're extracting the database, extracting the files, and then using the database to update the files as they migrate that data. It's essentially doing what the source pack system does when you make the request through a retrieve, DICOM retrieve. But this is typically many times faster, and it also has a great reduction in the impact, processing impact, and the database impact, and everything else on the legacy system. But it's not always available. It does depend that you can give storage connection to the data migration engine, and that the legacy packs vendor will provide the database access. These days, a lot of the legacy imaging data is stored in managed IT systems like a PACS or VNA, but you may get asked, and it's worthwhile determining if any of the imaging records are outside of those systems. For example, imaging records on file systems that have no application managing them or database to index, or even portable media like USB drives that may have come from some ancillary department mini packs, but has not been migrated into the legacy packs, but there is value or a desire to bring those into the system. So next couple of steps, you have your pre-analysis and your analysis. So the pre-analysis you can use doing queries of the systems. It's advisable to assess the state of the data, at least at a high level. Consider all the data from the first exam stored, or at least the one that's in scope, including any exams stored prior to or without document modality work lists. So in other words, if you have a whole bunch of exams that were manually entered, trying to understand that. Looking at outside exam, importing and identifier localization procedures. Most organizations, when they bring an outside exam, they'll generate a order from the RIS and overwrite the header. But depending on which sites you bought and what was going on and how many packs admins you've had and what they did, you may have a bunch that still have outside identifiers. How many RIS you've used? It's not uncommon for packs that have been around a long time, or data sets have been around a long time, to have been ordered from 2 or 3 different RISs since the beginning, and each one of them may have had a different set of orderable procedures, meaning that they're not all easily identifiable by the same terminology. You also want to consider things like the consistency of patient IDs, a patient merge, unmerged success. I've seen systems where they believed patient merge was on, and they found out for 12 years it wasn't actually working. So there was a lot of cleanup and having to go back to the EMR and extract data and then give the tables to the data migration vendor to do those fix-ups. Doing some analysis, typically using the data migration tools of the provider at the start of the data migration process. For each data source, they'll do an inventory of the data and basically report, here's what is in that source system. And it's usually advisable to conduct some analysis on that actual inventory for things like missing or invalid attribute values, common ones like patient ID, session numbers, and even just inconsistent ones. So if they don't match the schema that you use. The other, got a couple slides left, and I'll hand it to Mike. Data evaluation continued. The data requiring format conversion. So these things can include, as I mentioned, the Hologic SEO format, which is archivable but not viewable by systems outside of Hologic workstations. Converting those to DICOM BTO, a number of vendors can do that, which makes them viewable by any system, including enterprise viewers. Proprietary markups that might be in the PACS database to DICOM GSPS. In some cases, key images that are only marked in the PACS database, those can be extracted, and then a valid DICOM KOS or key object selection object is generated and stored. So there's some things you want to consider. And those are things often you have to include, at least loop in the clinical aspects of your governance so that they understand the effort involved, and they can comment on how important that is for them. Now, when you're requiring migrating reports, it's important. There's a few things to consider. The source system, which might be the EMR or the legacy PACS or VNA. The EMR is generally considered the source of truth, but when it was built, it may have only imported 7 to 10 years worth of the most recent reports. So the legacy PACS database may be the only system you can actually get those older ones. The format of those reports has to be considered. In most cases, you can extract them from a database like the PACS database. But we've seen these, are you going to get them as a database record extract? Or are you going to get them as a push of ORUs to an HL7 feed? Are they stored as files? I've seen ones that store them as a file in RTF or Word format. It could be available in the legacy system. They were, as the ORU was sent into that system, they may have been converting them automatically to DICOM SRs as a basic or enhanced DICOM structure report. So all of these things you should analyze and say, how are we going to get them? Typically, they can be extracted from the database. Some cases you have to go and grab these things and then find out how you get the patient and accession identifiers. If you're going to rely on the DICOM SR format to bring over, it is highly recommended that you really look at those because there's a couple different profiles that can be used and ensure that's supported by the new system. I've seen organizations who check the box, we're going to use DICOM structure report, but they were stored in enhanced, and the new system only supported basic, so there was some work to be done. Understanding the method, whether it's going to send it through HL7, a database import, all those things, so you have to work with the vendors on that. And one approach is if you can get an extract but can't do the import to the new system, is use an interface engine that essentially generates an ORU for each row and then sends it into the system pre-go live. That's a system method I've used a few times. And then understanding really the scope of, or you take all or some of it. There may be some cases where the reports from some sources are really difficult or impossible to extract. So you need, again, to use your governance for all that stuff. So the last slide, and then I'll hand it to Mike. When we take a look at what I've described are typical patterns, but in the age of AI, like where can AI help us with a lot of the things I just talked about? It's not hard to imagine that early on in this process, an AI algorithm could really look at that inventory collection and understand where are the invalid, missing, or inconsistent attribute values. Doing some processing, looking at that stuff and trying to highlight and visualize where you're going to run into issues. It could also be used in data normalization. So for example, if you've got 4 or 5 different sources, all that use different procedure terminology, and you want it to normalize to some standard library of terms, so like CT head width without contrast, and have those consistent, it may be able to do that analysis and mapping to say, here are all the exams that I'm going to map to this and that. Otherwise, right now you have to have someone generate this mapping table, compare, replace, that the vendor has to do for you. And this can apply to procedure terminology, series terminology, anatomy, labeling, and other attribute values. So I went through that fairly quickly because I did want to leave time for questions. So I am now going to, we'll do our questions at the end. I'm now going to hand control to Mike.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Cool. Wait a few seconds to get control.
You got it?
Almost.
There you go.
All right, cool. We'll do it live. Got it. So yeah, thanks, Don. That was a great covering the first a couple bullet points, really laying out the best practices for the framework of migrations. Super thoughtful. I always think of those as like a recipe from like an expert chef. And what I'm going to try to talk through is the execution of some of those best practices and just give some lesson learned from my experience doing data migrations from various different levels, from smaller hospitals, some smaller departments to, from an enterprise health system perspective. So I'm going to cover migration process, data cleaning, data validation, and migration project closeout, some of the operational aspects around that. So starting with the data migration process, and again, I'm going to pull some things that you've heard in Don's slides and really try to give, sort of an operational perspective, how we execute these things. So it all starts with knowing best practices and executing best practices. That in itself is sometimes the difference between a very successful migration or a very bumpy migration that never seems to end. In my career, I've done a lot of migrations. Some of the early ones, I would definitely go back and do things a little bit differently. One of the most important things probably to highlight is that governance. It's part of the strategy, and governance for stuff like migrations is super helpful. I often find that migrations are often tied to some other large project, whether that's a hardware refresh, a software platform refresh, implementing a new PACS, changing PACS vendors. There's usually a data migration component that drives that larger project. And I think from a governance perspective, you'll see some overlap. And it's very important to make sure that everybody understands the common goals. For us at Maryland, when we did our big PACS consolidation of it was about 7 or 8 PACS systems consolidating into one, everybody called it sort of, the new PACS project. But every slide I presented to leadership and really any aspect of it, setting the table for governance was, yes, it's a new PACS, but we have 3 things to worry about. One is data migration, implementation of new PACS, and decommission of the legacy systems. And the idea there where they were all tied to each other, just presenting that over and over gave governance and the group pretty good confidence. Also about governance, you need to make sure you have the right folks there. Sometimes health systems have different titles. There's folks who are more influential, some folks who have different levels of comfortability and confidence. That stuff matters in the practical sense of governance. So in your organizations, when you're setting up governance, really take that into consideration. And you'll find if you've got a good governance group, you've got a group to go for guidance so that your decision making is that much more confident. Also, vendor relationships and project management are incredibly important to migrations. If you have strong vendor relationships, good partnerships, you'll see the engineering side of those data migrations. Those conversations are really helpful. There's a lot of times when you get into that data analysis, it's definitely like a rabbit hole kind of thing. And you really do need to get the engineering level involved if you really want the quality that everybody kind of expects. And if you have good relationships, I find that engineering, getting access to those experts is always helpful. And again, project management. This is a project. It always starts off as a task, and maybe in some other, in the leadership's eyes, it's, oh, just pick up the data and move it. But it's really a project. Got to be very thoughtful on it. In the overview of like a migration process, a couple things that I just want to touch on. Retention policies and scope. This is usually the beginning discussions for migration projects. Retention policies really help decide what data you have to move off the legacy hardware platform. So in this example, imagine you have a bunch of legacy PACS systems that have been around and they have data that might be 10 years old or even older. And your retention policies for your organization say that you need to keep data for 7 years and then PEDS, for 23 years. Just throwing those out there that may or may not, but we use at Maryland, but that's an example. But when you have those in policies, then it's not a question. You say, here's the data we're picking up, here's the data we're moving. But if you don't have those retention policies, you could be in this endless scope discussions where they're like, what should we meet? What should we move? What shouldn't we move? And a lot of times you have the policy, refer to it, and it allows you to move on. Data movement and validation. Data movement, again, pretty straightforward. I'll talk later about it, but here's where I think a lot of AI might start to help us out. But the validation is key steps. I talk more about it in later slides. And then it's also important to talk about project closure and contract closure. I'll hint again at later slides in this one, but because this is a project, it should be associated with a statement of work, which is really a contract between the two parties, making sure that here's how we're going to do it, here's what we're going to do. And when it's in writing, it's not as complicated as well, how did that conversation go? Or it's hearsay. It gets very complicated. So you want to make sure the contract talks about it, and that when you're framing up your data migration process, that people aren't afraid to write it down. And that allows people to be on the same page, high comfortability, high confidence that everybody's going to end at the same destination. So extremely critical. So a couple examples that I ran into with data migrations. In some of the migrations, some of the data never had a real home. It wasn't the greatest of data. It somehow snuck into the PACS system because the PACS was the only place that seemed mature enough to store it. Like, hey, they're storing this stuff in radiology. We got some images that look like radiology. Let's just shove them in. In the practical sense, we've always found that these were rather small amounts of data. They always use like exception workflows or staff-dependent workflows. Like staff-dependent is more like that person had worked here for a very long time and they always did it this way. So all new staff were onboarded by that person, so they did it the same way. Classic example of hand-entered data a certain way. These do come up, and I'd like to say they come up on day one, but it's usually like a few, right when you're trying to close things out and do your validation and analysis, you start to find some of these. There's not much you can do with it, but again, if you have really strong policies, you can go back and say, hey, is everybody comfortable with executing policy XYZ? Because this data, it applies to this, so you can kind of work from there. Another example that comes up, and from the health system perspective, imagine 8 hospitals doing something slightly different. When we were doing our migrations, the QA data, the phantoms that were generated over the years, different hospitals did different things. And the migration project, we were forced to have an answer for this. And it ultimately turned into the migration project really defining the process moving forward. So in that circumstance, we had to, how we thought through it was, what were the processes that led to this behavior? Again, think staff-dependent workflows or whatever that organization had at the time. They used the tools they had, very common. What was that department's vision? Did that leadership have a really robust QA platform and QA process, or did they not? Once we understood what happened, we went back to the governance group, had them standardize on how we should move this forward, had to get out organizational support. Current tools was a good way to figure out, hey, we can do it this way now, as opposed to how it's always been done. Very common language in IT, and we try to move away from those when appropriate. But here, it's just an example of something to think through. And it was really our governance group that did it. Like, we brought all the information, the expertise on the project side, took it to the governance group. It was all the right players there, got a decision, and we were able to move forward with things. So again, that's how we thought through it. Just maybe that applies and can find that helpful. Data cleaning, this big topic. When you're moving, say, I don't know, 10 million exams, there's going to be some very small percent, I hope, that is not the cleanest of all data. So if you pick up all of it and move it over, obviously some of it won't go. The big thing is, how do you identify that data? And sometimes this is a slippery slope or a black hole. Those are some common things that we've used to describe these kind of things. But it's about understanding the workflow. And I think of it in terms of the data. A great example from Don is like, you think of a nightclub, they have a bouncer. Bouncer's outside. But once you get inside, there's not a lot of bouncers anymore. So when you're looking at the data flow, you've got a couple opportunities during migrations, because you have the source, you have a transfer mechanism, and then you've got a destination. So in some scenarios, and again, the same vendor or application may be playing multiple roles, but you've got really at minimum 3 places where you can check for data with whatever constraints you have. A lot of times matching DICOM data to some other external source, the EMR. Nowadays we have FHIR, so you can get something and check real fast. There's a lot of ways to do it, but I would just offer, think through the data flow, the sources and destinations, and opportunities where you can have multiple checkpoints. You get the highest quality if you have that. There's also operational considerations. Not all data can be turned from bad to good. Like, do you need those QA systems for the CT scanner from 10 years ago that you decommissioned a few years ago? I would hope no one would need those, but again, organizationally, your operation leaders have to figure that out. Pretty obvious answer for that one. But the operational leaders and the policy, it should be where that goes. I have personal experience where people would almost ask me personally, Mike, what are we doing with this data? Are we keeping it? as if it was my decision to make. And I got some great advice from some mentors before that said, it's never your decision, Mike. Just be very straightforward about that. But what I would do is lean into the policy that would apply, or the retention policy, or if we didn't have anything that clearly applied, putting it to the governance group. And in the PACS world, we really have to empower the frontline staff not to be making those decisions, but also, making sure that they can respond to whoever's asking them and get them to the right spot. So it really creates it's more of a culture type thing. Also with data cleaning, AI tools can really help with this step. A lot of intelligent automation has happened over the years. Some of the things that we're doing with research data and movement there and extracting data, the data flow kind of looks the same as a migration. You have a source, you pull it out, you might transform it, and then it ultimately has some sort of destination, which might be a place where they can do some machine learning on it, or that kind of stuff. So migrations, they have a similar workflow, and we're trying to use a lot of AI to help us, get those cohorts, identify that. So we're definitely going to see some growth in that area. The other thing that AI might be able to do is help explain some of this bad data scenario. When Don was talking about the evaluation slide, when we were doing analysis of one of our PAC systems that we were migrating off of, we had found like 2 weeks where the data was just horrible. And it also correlated with a major PACS downtime catastrophe that we had. It was a smaller site, had a very non-redundant PACS system, and they had a data storage problem. So the database knew of the metadata, but the actual pixel data was not restored from the full backup system restore. Fun fact about that story, that happened 8 months after I started as a PACS admin. So not a lot of time in the career to have that happen, but got through it. It's fun, great learning experience. But having AI, imagine a chatbot saying, hey, can you tell me what happened August 2006? And then, hey, here's all the emails, here's all the data I found from your repositories. Really helpful in explaining that root cause, could give high value. And then also an impact analysis. If I didn't have a week's worth of data, it would take me a while to figure out the impact of that. But, through maybe a chatbot or some calculations, they could say, well, in that time period, now that you're 6 years out, the chance of any of those coming up as relevant priors would probably be, something small. So impact analysis may be helpful, maybe not, but definitely see it as a future where AI can help. Waiting for it to switch to the next slide.
Want me to do it? I'll do that.
Yeah, cool. So data validation, probably the most important step. There's one thing I learned in my entire career, quality matters. Not just because I think we all kind of take pride in our work. We want systems up all the time. We want flawless data, high bar. And I think healthcare leaders also know that quality matters. And when the IT systems and the data in those systems are of the utmost quality, it allows them to provide the best patient care. That's a story that I'm constantly telling in all of my roles in IT. So data validation is where the quality shines within migrations and data movement in general, and data management in general. It's also critical for getting organizational confidence at all levels. So from the users, from the leadership at the department, from the executive C-suite leaders, if you have great data quality because you've done the data validation work, that confidence shines, and it really helps in anything that you do in the future. It also needs to be automated and multi-tiered. With a lot of our data migrations, it's all script-based for the most part. And if it's not, we always seek to make it script-based. And we have numerous scripts, one to move the data, one to check the data, one to check. And a lot of it is very automated. We rely heavily on audit logs. There are some challenges. Sometimes the vendor has scripts. Sometimes we use in-house scripts. I find the bigger the data set, the more that we use a hybrid approach. We like to keep the vendors honest, and they're always appreciative of that. I shouldn't say always, but in most cases, they're definitely appreciative of that. And at the end of the day, when we, go to close out these projects, when we have rock solid documentation that proves great validation, it's smooth sailing. When there's holes in that, or it can't be found, or it doesn't feel like it's well put together, confidence starts to drift. So in some of our early projects, we definitely had to deal with that. And it just took longer to get to that documentation level. So pro tip there, details of the process and outcome need to be in the contract and statement of work. When you are working with a vendor and you're using in-house scripts, that is a good example of something that would be great to have written down in contract with signatures and not really penalties, but like how your organization wants to understand the risk. Because if the vendor's moving the data and they don't achieve it, there could be some risk that your organization may have to assume. So in any case, when you're doing migrations, get as much as you can about process, outcomes, who's doing what. There's tons of great data on how to build very strong statement of works, but it is of utmost importance when you're doing a migration, because when you get to the validation step, that's where you're going to be going back to the contract to make sure everything is up to par. Next slide, Don. So closing out a project, obviously, as I just mentioned, it'll be easier if you have strong validation in place, and you can follow the processes that you've defined and agreed upon in the statement of work. In this particular case, the statement of work really starts to look like that recipe you're trying to follow, and it allows everybody to be on the same page. When you have large-scale migration projects, it's very easy to get a lot of players involved the entire time. And when you have a statement of work, everybody can see what the next step is, what the previous step was, and who did them. So you can navigate these things that come up by automatically going back to the playbook. And again, spending a lot of time on that strategy part and the statement of work, it will pay dividends as you get through your large-scale data migration. Need procedures for what to do when something unexpected is found. Again, I've talked on a couple examples. Dirty data pops up, and I often try to have a hospital policy at the ready that we can apply. Because again, it shouldn't be a personal decision, but I've been in these cases, and I definitely have taken it personally when something didn't go well. Like, hey, was it my fault that data wasn't clean a couple of years ago? Did somebody not fix something? But when you have policies around, well, how do you fix up data? What is your process around fixing up data from a few years ago? If you still have that available, you can start to remove some anxiety and tension from some of those discussions, and then get back to the policy that might say, hey, if the data is missing, here's our steps. We refer to the report stored in the EMR, and that's retention is 25 years or something. It's just nice to have a policy to go to. It helps diffuse the situation. Also ran into cases where people were like, hey, Mike, I can't find the data. I thought it would have been migrated. And then we dive in and say, hey, that was research data from outside of our retention window. So that's why it's not migrated. And having a policy to refer to for that makes it not feel like it was my decision to get rid of that data. So again, really helps having a good culture there for that. The other part of a migration closeout where I think it really, really ends is when you recycle that hardware. There is literally no going back from that. Assuming you get rid of the hardware and the tapes, if you were doing backup tapes back then. And we actually have specific policies about electronic recycling that the early part of those policies ask for documentation about data migration. So it's a requirement. So we're coming at it from multiple angles, but these are kind of fail-safe, catch-all kind of policies. So yes, it feels a little bureaucratic sometimes because we have so many policies, but it's easy to read a policy as almost instructions. So, hey, are you thinking about everything? And the policy is usually like a checklist. Next slide. So a couple quick next steps for closing out the project. So this is more of you've done your migration. How do you move back into regular operations? Assume a strong validation. That's pretty common. We usually do like a trust but verify kind of thing, which is also pretty common. Because these are often associated with new systems, there's a lot of moving pieces. So the migration now was 1/3 of the big like PACS replacement project. Because there's so much moving around, we assume everything went well, but we're also high alert for making sure like, hey, we're not seeing a single piece of data. We like to evaluate those and dive deep to make sure it doesn't open up a bigger problem. And some of the things moving forward, because we just moved all that data, it's in this brand new shiny system. What if we had something like a data health checker close to real time? This is where we start to think about how can AI help. But hopefully in your new PACS or your new VNA, your new platform, you have some new tools, you have some scripts. We can do a better job. We just spent all this time moving all this data, cleaning up what we could. Let's take some of those and turn them into best practices that we're able to use in real time. And it's important to be thinking about this. Always enhancements and what can we do to make things better, hold that quality bar higher. And specifically to that quality bar, so you moved all this data, you cleaned it, it's in the new system, it's clean. You're implementing health checkers that are keeping your data clean. The next step would be make sure your clinical users and leadership understand the value that brings. Sometimes you have to tell them very straightforward. It's really good to show data and evidence of reports like, hey, our QC, our number of requests for missing priors is going down. Anything that you can kind of track on, it would be good. But at the end of the day, you really want that leadership group to know and have confidence that, hey, we moved all this data. We're in a better place than where we were on the new system with data living in the new place. So next slide, I think, is just some AI considerations. I touched on a couple of these, so I'll go fast. Intelligent automation. When you have repetitive actions, it's obviously automation, but I think the intelligence side of it, being able to query, learn, and then grab only what you need. These are just examples where AI can help with efficiency. Chatbots. I know I've mentioned contracting a lot. Chatbots and contracting for me, I think is something that might pop up. And data review and validation, pretty straightforward there. Gen AI for script creation. We might only have a few developers, but using Gen AI, it's a little bit easier now to make some scripts or at least get started and bring some awareness to that. So I'm seeing that happening more and more. And one of my personal things is having AI do more of our testing work. A lot of testing is simulating the real world and just getting human eyes on it. I think AI could really help out there. They can run scripts faster, pull data, kind of like robotic almost. It's a weird world to think of, but I think it'll allow us to do more valid testing in a much shorter time frame and get much better results with our implementations. Cool. So that is the end of my slides.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to the both of you. Really appreciate those insightful words. We have some questions, and hopefully you've had some chance to look at them. I'm going to paraphrase. I'm not going to read verbatim what Louise put in, but it's around talking about supplement 223 and DICOM working group 33, where we're making it a lot easier to be able to perform queries against repositories and archive sources. And he has some comments around where would you see this fitting in, and where we see AI as well. And he alludes to a couple examples for predictive care and so on. So I'm curious. I'll give you guys both an opportunity to provide some comments on that.
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, the DICOM supplement 223 is a relatively new one, and it basically gives clients the ability to get an answer of the inventory of the source system that it's querying and can be used for that. The thing is, during migrations, there is already, for well over a decade, kind of reliable methods, either by contacting the database directly and extracting it with the interface engine and the team behind it. Sorry, not the interface, the migration engine and the team behind it, kind of understanding the DICOM information model and all the relationships, and often having experience with that database schema. The other method is a DICOM crawl. They basically start doing date-based queries and inventorying the responses to build up a list of all at least at the exam level, everything that's in there. So the method during data migrations, I might argue, is kind of solved, at least through the methods that are available, and they seem to be reliable. This would provide something more standards based, I guess. But the question I think was during the workflows and for AI, we take a look at IHE. I think there's now two profiles. There's at least one that I think is final, that talk about during regular workflow how to invoke AI systems, and what are some of the outputs from that. What are some of the standards based formats of the output from that system? So I think that's where more people are kind of looking to invoke AI. The one question that I think is interesting is, if we were to look at this repository query and say, okay, let's take a look at everything that's in there, and then let's run AI against that. That raises the question of, what are we actually going to do with what we find out? So now we're going to go back 20 years and find out how often our radiologists missed stuff. What do we do with that? Do we now call those patients? Do we pull that stuff up? Do we, exposing ourselves to legal risk? There's a lot of debate at the thought leadership level as to who would pay for that. And let's assume it's relatively inexpensive because it's automated. What do you do with the answer, with the outcomes of that, if it's not consistent with what the diagnostic radiologist said? And I think that's probably a bigger question than those of us who work down in the data level.
Mike, any comments that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Don. I think the current migration processes are probably well established. I don't think the vendors would shift to something so new so fast. But I do think in-house developers and those folks looking to solve specific problems, as they're making some of these homegrown scripts, figuring out how can I ask the AI, giving that new DICOM aspect, making it a tool for their AI chatbots and sort of their AI agents. That's a better one to say. I definitely see that happening over the next year or so.
Okay. And there was a question about, Mike, you had alluded that, there's sometimes data is just not going to be fixable potentially. And, it's always a point where you've got your migration and it's that last little bit that's going to take the most time. And maybe it's not going to be fixable at all. What are your thoughts around quarantine? Should they be migrated at all? If you want to expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah. The real quick answer is we have definitely created spots within our VNA for quarantine data. So like if it was hand entered in the first place, we know we may not get great matches from a source of truth. So we do save it, but it's accessible through not standard means, but we do retain it. And we have a process in place for if someone is looking for this component of data, here's the process. Sometimes it's engaged, through a help desk ticket, and then we have knowledge base about how to access that stuff. So not convenient by any means, but we did establish, hey, there's risk in moving this data in, and the organization said, don't move that in, and just give us a best practice process to get to the data.
And the methods of setting up a quarantine system are much easier than they would have been. You think back 10 years ago, what it would have involved to set up, a pseudo type test PACS environment, which we've done. And so now, it's easy to pull containers and set up something that might never get used, but at least you've got it.
Yeah.
You basically got stuff you can clean, put right into the clinical, stuff you want to clean, but it's going to take time. So you put it into a bucket that's not discoverable. And then as it gets cleaned, goes into the clinical. You have stuff that you want to keep in a system, but you don't have a way to clean it or don't care enough to clean it. And then you have stuff you can't get into that system, which is you just shoebox it, is what most people do. It's like, you can get it out of this system, put it in a file system, take a snapshot, document, this is what's in there, and everyone signs off. And then if some legal discovery comes along, and at that point you're going to pay the money to do some kind of recovery, then you can do that. But hopefully you have most of them in the first categories.
Yeah.
Michael, go on.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add, as you go through those options, in my career, as we've expanded outside of radiology, which is extremely mature with this, if we go into enterprise imaging, we start to see some of these other ologies, and some of the latter shoeboxes are way bigger than the clean data, just because of the workflows. The technology didn't grow as fast as every radiology device has a modality work list. Every once in a while, you saw something outside of radiology that modality work list was optional. So it hurts that was a choice, but You start to see that in the enterprise imaging space. It's gotten much better as enterprise imaging really becomes that, standardized process.
So you spoke about research data and clinical trial data. Maria Hills had a question about how would you go about classifying in making those categories?
They often go into their own storage buckets, for better terms. But we also tie it to research. So when we have a research class of data, it's always tied to some like IRB or initiative or something along those lines. And our policy documents how we do that and where we store it. And even the research itself, we built in retention into that. So we know that we don't store research data in perpetuity because our clinical policies don't really cover research. And then we just make sure each of our research use cases, retention is a requirement. That's got to get sign off.
And I think one of the key things there you said is policy. Make sure the organization has a policy or push them to come with one. It's just you have to remember, everybody has to understand, is sometimes research data is a copy of the clinical data. Maybe it's de-identified. It can be very large, might be 2 million CTs. And the person who did the research has been gone for 5 years, but you're paying storage on-prem or in the cloud every month for it with no new revenue, and it's a copy. So you have to make sure everybody who writes the policy understands the cost implications. Because it's very easy to say, yep, no problem, we're going to keep it forever.
Okay, I appreciate your time. We've got 2 questions. What we'll do is I think we're at a racetrack here. So we've done this in the past. We'll take those offline and maybe we can have you guys respond to them and then we can post those to the forum. And then for everyone that is still on, just plugging next month, we have Dr. Evans from Mackenzie Health, and he'll be sharing his journey establishing digital pathology networks for patient care. And also just a quick little plug. This was a great conference that I used to volunteer for before, and I'm now back volunteering again for it. Medical Imaging Informatics and Teleradiology. Dr. David Koff used to run this, and it went on pause during COVID. Just wanted to let everyone know about this. This is a really great one-day event for learning about imaging informatics from a Canadian perspective. So if you have an opportunity to get to Hamilton, Ontario, I would highly recommend it. With all that said, everyone, have a great weekend. Thank you very much, Don. Thanks, Michael.